Welcome to Varn Vlog's Nailing It Down series on the critique of the Gotha Program. We're in sub-series 3. I say sub-series 3 because we've gone through the original text and letters, we've gone through the Socialist Labor Party, and now we're in the middle of Lenin's 1916 text, State and Revolution, Chapter 5. The economic basis of the withering away of the state, which is the primary place where the positive use of the critique of the Gotha program is established. And, yeah, I point out a few vaguenesses that could be abused in this text already. I haven't seen anything that explicitly contradicts any reading of Marx, so there are definitely people who think that, and we will explore some essays talking about that eventually. We still need to go through these historical explications first, and so this series will focus on Lenin's State and Revolution's use, and we'll talk about Karl Korsch's introduction from the 1920s as well. All right, that'll be the next round. But anyway, let's get into this. We are in Chapter 5 of State and Revolution, subsection 3, the first phase of communist society. And let me pull up the text here so you can follow along with us as we read. And I am, of course, using the Marxist.org version, which I believe is a version of the Progress Publishers Edition. All right. The first phase of communist society. In the critique of the Gotha program, Marx goes into detail to disprove Lasalle's idea that under socialism, the worker will receive the undiminished or full product of his labor. Marx shows that from the whole social labor of society, there must be deducted a reserve fund, a fund for the expansion of production, a fund for the replacement of the wear and tear of machinery, and so on. I would say that reserve fund's actually not quite what he means. I mean, reserve fund is like you need reserve labor, but reserve fund sounds like you're storing currency or capital. And what Marx means is you need, a reserve of production, and some of that's going to have to be accounted for in a reserve fund of labor hours of the equivalent materials. All right, anyway, back to this. Then, from the measure of consumption must be deducted a fund for the administrative expenses, for schools and hospitals, for old people's home, and so on. So you need to set aside some stuff for reinvestment and for maintaining machinery, and then you need to reassign some stuff for administrative expenses, schools, hospitals, and whatnot. But here we do not mean currency in the sense that it is meant in a capitalist society. We meant account of labor hours, usually in the term of labor tokens, which are equalized under socially necessary labor time, and then spent on the equivalent amount of labor of goods or services. Instead of Lasalle's hazy, obscure general phase, the full product of his labor to the worker, Marx makes a sober estimate of exactly how socialist society will manage its affairs. Marx proceeds to make a concrete analysis of the conditions of the life and the society in which there will be no capitalist, and says, I love how this is a big claim for basically a sentence. This is where I'm talking. This is a quote from, we have to deal with the here in analyzing the program of the Workers' Party in a communist society, not as developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, as it emerges from a capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, intellectually still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whom room it comes. It is this communist society, which has just emerged in the light of day of the womb of capitalism, which has in every respect stamped with the birthmarks of the old society. Marx's first or lower phase of a communist society. Now, the means of production are no longer the property of the individual. The means of production belong to the whole society. Every member of society performing a certain socially necessary work receives a certificate from the society to the effect that he has done a certain amount of work. And this certificate receives from the public store the consumer goods corresponding to the quantity of products. After the deduction is made of the amount of labor which goes to the public fund, every worker therefore receives from society as much as he is given to it. Equality apparently reigns supreme. But when Lasalle, having in such a view of social order, usually called socialism, but termed by Marx the first phase of communism, says that this is, quote, equitable distribution and that it has the equal weight of all to the equal product of labor, Lasalle is mistaken, and Marx exposes a mistake. Quote, hence the equal weight, says Marx, in the case still certainly conforms to bourgeois law, which, like all law, implies inequality. A law is an application of equal measure to different people who are in fact not alike and are not equal to one another. This is why equal weight is a violation of equity and an injustice. In fact, everyone, having performed such social labor as another, receives an equal share of the social product after the aforementioned deductions. But people are not alike. One is strong and one is weak. One is married and one is not. One has more children, one has less, and so on. And the conclusion Marx draws is, quote, with equal performance of labor, hence an equal share in the consumption fund, one will receive, in fact, more than another. One will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid these defects, the right, instead of being equal, would have to be unequal. The first phase of communism, therefore, cannot yet provide justice and equality. Differences and unjust differences in wealth will still persist. But the exploitation of man by man will have become impossible because it will be impossible to seize the means of production, the factories, the lands, etc., and make them private property. In smashing Lasalle's petty bourgeois vague phrase about equality and justice in general, Marx shows the course of the development of communist society, which is compelled to abolish at first only the injustice of the means of production seized by the individuals, which will be unable to at once eliminate other injustices, which consist in the distribution of consumer goods according to the amount of labor performed and not according to need. The vulgar economists, including our bourgeois professors and our Turgen, and I believe he's referring to Miguel Baranowski Turgen. Michel Baranowski Turgen was a Menshevik. Michelle, I have his name backwards. Miguel Turgen Baranowski, was a Menshevik economist and statesman, very crucial to development of the business theory cycle, even to the German historical school and to the Austrian school. He's an important member. He was a leading exposition of what would later become legal Marxism. And that's associated with Benyadev and Bulgakov and Simon Frank. Legal Marxism thought that picked up from Bukharin that you needed to actually develop capitalism to develop socialism, and that needed to happen before, not after the revolution. So ironically, Tugen was important for the Plekhannovites and people who thought that you had to go through a complete bourgeois revolution before trying to attempt a communist one. And Tugen's actually in pretty consistent views of Plekhanov. Later on in his life, Tugen was to be associated with both Neo-Kantianism, which is kind of strange, and he was a finance member of the central government of Ukraine, but for a very brief period of time, August and November 1917. He died in 1919. So, but that's who Lenin's talking about. Constantly reproached the socialists for forgetting the inequality of the people and with dreaming of eliminating the inequality. Such a reproach, as we see, is only proves the extreme ignorance of the bourgeois ideologists. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's just, one of Lenin's normal digs. It doesn't actually say that much. Marx was not only the most scrupulously takes account of the inevitable inequality of men. It's like 2 paragraphs, Lenin, come on, in a private letter. But he also takes into account the fact that the mere conversion of the means of production into common property of the whole society, commonly called socialism, does not remove the defects of distribution and inequality of bourgeois laws, which continue to prevail as products are divided each according to the labor performed. Now, I think that's important because I think Lenin's right to read this here, but it's interesting because later people will take this reading by Lenin and interpolate it to mean that capital markets and stuff need to be in the first phase of socialism, aka that you could have state capitalism as a part of socialist development. Lenin actually argues that too at certain points because he realizes they need to have capitalist development, but that they've had a revolution before the completion of a bourgeois revolution, which changes the entire schema. But I think this is interesting on another reason too, because Lenin clearly understands that we are not talking about just having capitalism. What we are talking about is that labor tokens would still, and because they're merely accounting for work put in and work put out, labor tokens would not actually equalize everyone's access to goods. It would just radically change, it would radically level the playing field in a lot of ways. But since people can't do the same amount of work and you're getting paid for work put in, and you're getting paid for work put in terms of hours, by the way, that might not be clear. This is not work put in terms of hours and efficiency of production, not by value added. There's no such concept in Marx. That we are still dealing with something like actually the peasant system and the Cultural Revolution in China. That's what we're dealing with here, not like just the government owning controlling shares and joint stock companies. Like, that's not what we're talking about. All right. But I do think also Lenin's like tendency towards, frankly, hyperbole here gets a little bit old. And so in the first phase of communist society, the so-called socialism, bourgeois law is not abolished entirely, but only in part, only in proportion to the economic revolution so far attained, aka only in respect to the means of production. Everybody owns means of production, but we don't all have equal. Everybody does not have, equal food or whatever. But we're gonna, the worst will be taken care of once production is equalized and control of that production is universalized through democratic means. Bourgeois law recognizes them as the private property of individuals. Socialism converts them into common property. To that extent, and to that extent alone, bourgeois law disappears. However, it persists as far as other parts is concerned. It persists in the capacity of the regulator, the determining factor in the distribution of products, and the allotment of labor among members of society. Now, regulator here is the determining factor, not as a person. The socialist principle, he who does not work does not eat, is already realized. The other socialist principle, an equal amount of products to an equal amount of labor, is already realized. But this is not yet communism and does not yet abolish bourgeois law, which gives unequal individuals in return to really unequal amounts of labor, equal amounts of products. This is a defect, says Marx, but it is unavoidable in the first phase of communism. For we are not to indulge in utopianism. We must not think at having overthrown the capitalism, people will at once learn to work for society without any rules of law. Besides, the abolition of capitalism does not immediately create the economic prerequisites for such a change. Now, there are no other rules than those of bourgeois law. To this extent, therefore, there still remains a need for a state which, while safeguarding the common ownership of the means of production, would safeguard equity in labor and in distribution of products. Asterisk, and there people go, well, this is completely workers. It'll let all the poor and whatnot die. Remember that Lenin, just like Marx, has actually said that we need stuff for people who can't work. All right, that's part of why there's a quote reserve fund. So no, he's not going to let those people die, but they're not necessarily going to be able to have a whole lot. Like, they're basically wards of the state. Now, that's not ideal when you're trying to get rid of the state. I'm not going to lie. But to the extent that this is ableist, this is ableist with conditions like we're gonna take care of those people, but it's still unjust because you will have people who, through striving or whatever, will be able to get more product, or be able to have more children, etc. So we're not yet at a stage where everyone can have complete control of their time unless they want to be poor. All right. Now, when you realize that this is what Marx actually argued as a framework, you do realize that like a lot of socialists today don't actually agree with this. To this extent, therefore, there still remains a need for, we already talked about that. The state withers away insofar there is no longer any capitalist, any classes, and consequently no class can be suppressed. Now, this is interesting. There's a lot being equated in this line. The state withers away insofar there are no longer any capitalist, any classes, and consequently no class can be suppressed. So is getting rid of capitalists going to cause a decline of other classes because there's non-capitalist classes? And the answer is no, and I don't think Lenin thinks that. But I see how this is another one of these vagaries, particularly in English. I suspect this might be clearer in Russian. Unfortunately, I got a minimal grasp of German. I do not have a grasp of Russian. This phrasing can be used to say that like just getting rid of capitalism gets rid of class. And Lenin, and it's actually clear in other parts of State and Revolution, does not think that. All right. But this is why you should be careful when people quote these texts out of context, just like you should be careful when people quote just a Bible verse. You really need to see the entire context of the quote to understand if it's legitimate, because this stuff is going to be abused later on. All right, but back to Lenin. But the state is not yet completely withered away and still remains the safeguard of bourgeois law, which sanctifies actual inequity. For the state was to wither away completely, complete communism is necessary. And by the way, this according to most Marxists, the only place where you get a positive definition of communism outside of some hints in the Brumaire and the political writings on the Civil War in France, etc. All right, the higher phase of communist society, section 4, and the final section. Marx continues, quote, "And the higher phase of communist society, after enslaving the subordination of the individual to the division of labor, which is also the antithesis between mental and physical labor, has vanished. After labor has become not only a livelihood, but last prime want, after the productive forces have increased with all-around development of the individual, all strings of the cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois law be left behind in its entirety, and socialism scribe on its banners, from each recording their own ability to each recording their needs." Now, this is interesting. All right. Okay. It's interesting that Lenin takes this according to State. Only now can we appreciate the correctness of Engels' remarks, mercilessly ridiculing the absurdity of combining words freedom and state. Free state. So long as the state exists, there is no freedom. Where there's freedom, there will be no state. The economic basis for complete withering away of the state is a high state of development of communism, which the antithesis between mental and physical labor disappears. Note that mental and physical labor are not considered separate things, but are only in contradiction in capitalist society, and which there consequently disappears one of the principal sources of social inequity, a source, moreover, which cannot be accounted for to be removed immediately by the mere conversion of means of production to public property, by the mere expropriation of the capitalist. This expiration will make it possible for productive forces to transfer to a tremendous extent. And we can see how incredibly capitalism is already retarding this development when we see how much progress could be achieved on the basis of the level of technique already attained, while we are entitled to say with the fullest confidence that the expropriation of the capitalist will inevitably result in enormous development of productive forces of human society. AKA, when you reinvest stuff and everyone has to collectively decide the reinvestment, there's a lot less capitalists just there gulping stuff up for their own inefficient needs. And if you don't believe me, why does patent law need so much investment from the NHS? If patent law was a successful thing to get corporations to, not NHI, excuse me, in America. If patent law was enough to get good drug development, for example. So much of that stuff goes just wasteful. Anyone who sees how tech startups work can see that. And how soon is the breaking away from the division of labor, of doing away with the antithesis between mental and physical labor, of transforming labor into life by month, we do and cannot know. This is why we are entitled to speak only of the withering away of the state, emphasizing the protracted nature of the process and its dependence upon the rapidity of development of the higher phase of communism, and leaving the question of time required for, or the concrete forms of, the withering away quite open, because there is no material for answering these questions. AKA, we don't know how long it's going to take to have enough to actually be able to, quote, provide from each according to his ability, each according to their need, and also not have a state which enforces that. We can say the withering away of the state will happen fairly quickly, but nonetheless. The state will be able to wither away completely when society adopts a rule from each according to his ability, each according to their need. I actually don't think that that's what's implied in that text. I don't see how how Lenin is actually connecting those, because Marx isn't talking about the state here. He actually says specifically the higher phase of communist society. Now, there's still a state in the lower phases of communist society, and there's still a state in the transition to that, which is a dictatorship of the proletariat. But he's not saying that we would necessarily actually get rid of the state only when we can do from each according to his own ability, each according to his needs. The state would already start to disappear before that, or at least to start to wither away. At least that's what Marx seems to imply. Lenin seems to imply this as a kind of tell, but this is only a tell of one shift of society to another. I'm not sure that Lenin is wrong here, but it's not actually what the text as I read it explicitly says. Anyway, back to text. The state will be able to wither away completely when society adopts rule from each according to his ability, each according to his need. AKA when people have become so accustomed to observing the fundamental rules of social intercourse, and when their labor has become so productive, they will voluntarily work according to their ability. The narrow horizon of bourgeois law, which compels one to calculate with the heartlessness of a Shylock whether or not one has worked a half an hour more than anyone else, this narrow horizon will then be left behind. We'll stop needing to do time accounting. That's what is being applied here. Although it's interesting here to think about what productivity means in this context. Like, what is the incentive to work to increase productivity in this context? Unless that's also compensated in terms of labor hours. That scheme has not worked out here, and admittedly, Marx would not think you could do that. That needs to be actually decided by the people doing it. That's a big Marx point. It's one of his arguments, weirdly, against anarchists. But nonetheless, it does seem like it does need to be mentioned in this kind of breakdown. All right. Then there will be no more need for society in distributing products to regulate the quantity to be received by each. Each will be taken freely according to his needs. Basically, there'll be no of a store of stuff that people can take what they need no matter what. And you can quit being so stingy with labor accounting. From the bourgeois point of view, it is easy to declare that such a social order is sheer utopia and sneer at the socialists for promising everyone the right to receive from society without any control over the labor of the individual citizen. Inequality of truffles, cars, pianos, etc. Even to this day, most bourgeois savants confine themselves to sneering this way, thereby betraying both their ignorance and their selfish defense of capitalism. Ignorance. For it has never been entirely ahead of any socialist to promise a higher phase of the communism will arrive. As for the greatest socialist forecast that will arrive, it presupposes not the present ordinary run of people who, like in seminary students and Polomovsky's stories, I'm going to actually see the footnote, reference to the pupils of seminary who won notoriety by extreme ignorance and barbarous customs as portrayed by N.G. Polomovsky, a rough and author. All right. Russia, 19th century Russia. Thanks. Where was I at? Apomilovsky's stories are capable of damaging the stock of public wealth just for fun and demanding the impossible. Until the higher phase of communism arrives, the socialists demand the strictest control by society and by the state over the measures of labor and by the means of consumption. That's not what that says. Demand the strictest control by society and by the state over the measures of labor and the measure of consumption. See, notice there's a shift here. In Lenin, at first, the state still exists to keep the capitalists from coming back and to fight a necessary civil war. Now, here we have the state needing to regulate the means of consumption. Not society doing it through social means. The state needs to do it too. And Lenin kind of has them side to side as if they're the same thing. I do think that's a sneaky trick. I don't think Lenin's trying to be deceptive. That's not my point here. But they're not the same thing. And Marx doesn't use those words. And if he did, he would have. I mean, if he meant them to be used together, he would have. Marx and Engels are very particular on what they want to call things. For example, Engels' whole stuff about taking the state out of the long-term goal and about making clear that nationalization and socialization aren't the same thing, things that contemporary socialists just don't fucking deal with at all. That's completely left behind in this discussion. Now, Marx and Engels could be persnickety, and to think that they wouldn't be persnickety on this is somewhat funny. But anyway, this control must start with the exportation of the capitalism, with the establishment of workers' control over the capitalism must be exercised not by a state of bureaucrats, but a state of armed workers. That's interesting too. That's something that never happened. The nomenclature was never just a state of armed workers, even though those people were from the working class. The reason why we can't say they were just a state of armed workers because their work was just a state, meaning they supplied also surplus of other people's labor. This created the problem in the Soviet Union when the nomenclature can only be controlled by violence. When the violence went away, they wreaked havoc. But you can't control everybody by violence forever. Society won't last when you do that. All right, back to this. I think it's interesting, though, because there's some ambiguity in what is meant by a state here. Like the state of armed workers, that's not just a party state. Like Lenin could say that. He doesn't say that. It's a state of the workers controlling their, like, making sure, everybody plays by the rules until you have enough that the rules can be changed. So while I think there's some loosey-goosiness here and some, frankly, mild equivocation, I actually still think it's a justifiable reading, and it's not what a lot of people accuse Lenin of doing. He's not trying to justify a sole party rule, even if that ends up being what happens. And I'm not the greatest Lenin stan in the world, as people know, but I do think we have to read the man fairly. The selfish defense of capitalism by bourgeois ideologists and their hangers-on, like the Zaratellas, Chernovovs, and co. I need to look up a bunch of who these people are. Consistent in the fact that they substitute arguing and about the distant future for the vital burning question of present-day politics, namely expiration of the capitalists, the conversion of all citizens into workers, and the employer and the employees of one huge syndicate, aka the whole state, and the complete subordination of the entire work of the syndicate to the generally democratic state, the state of the Soviet of workers and soldiers' deputies. Bam. A workers' council state. In fact, when the learned professor, followed by the Philistine, followed in turn by the Tessarellis and Chermanovs, talk about utopias of demagogic promises of the Bolsheviks, of the impossibility of introducing socialism, it is the higher stage or phase of communism he has in mind, and which no one has ever promised or even thought to introduce, because generally speaking, it cannot be introduced. And thus, this brings us to the question of the scientific distinction between socialism and communism, where Engels touched on in his above-quoted argument about the incorrectness of the name social democrat. Politically, the distinction between the first, our lower, and the higher phase of communism will in time probably be tremendous, but it would be ridiculous to recognize that distinction now under capitalism, and only individual anarchists, perhaps, could invest it with the primary importance, and if they are still able among anarchists who have learned nothing from the Plekhanov conversion of the Prokotkins of Grave, Koronessen, and other stars of anarchism and the social chauvinist or anarcho-trenchist, as Guy, one of the few anarchists who has still preserved a sense of humor and a conscience, has put it. Ouch. Those of you who don't know, this is of the way Kropotkin and Grave supported stuff in World War I. In a way that, mirrors the Social Democrats in Germany. A stage that many anarchists do not like to talk about. Anyway, but the scientific distinction between socialism and communism is clear. What is usually called socialism was termed by Marx the first or lower phase of communist society, insofar as it means that production becomes the common property, the word communism also applicable here, providing that we do not forget that it is not complete communism. The great significance of Marx's explanation here is that here, too, he consistently applies materialist dialectics, the theory of development, and regards of communism as something which develops out of capitalism instead of scholastically inverted, concocted definitions and fruitless disputes over words. What is socialism? What is communism? Marx gives us analysis of what might be called the stages of economic maturity of communism. In the first phase or first stage, communism cannot fully mature economically and entirely free from the traditions and vestiges of capitalism. This is what people use to this is where I'm talking. This is what people use to justify capitalism in quote communist states. That is not clearly what either Lenin or Marx was talking about. The legislative bourgeois law was time accounting and the need for time accounting through labor tokens. And that the labor tokens would limit what you could get. Hence, the interesting phenomenon of communism in the first page retains, quote, the narrow horizon of bourgeois law. Of course, bourgeois law in regards to distribution of consumer goods inevitably presupposes the existence of a bourgeois state, for the law is nothing without an apparatus capable of enforcing the observance of law. It's interesting here that you have a bourgeois state versus even under communism. That's a little strange. It follows that under communism, what remains for a time is not only bourgeois law, but even a bourgeois state without the bourgeoisie. Yeah, I don't think that's what that implies at all. Marx doesn't talk about the bourgeois state. He talks about the state as a bourgeois actor and then withering away the state as such. And notice that also Lenin above said that it would be a state of armed workers. Now he's saying that it's a bourgeois state of armed workers without bourgeoisie. That doesn't make that much sense. This may sound like a paradox or simply a dialectical conundrum of what Marxism is often accused of by people who have not taken the slightest trouble to study its extraordinarily profound content. True, but I've taken that time to study, and it does sound like a paradox. But in fact, the remnants of the old surviving and the new confront us at life with every step, both in nature and society, and Marx did not arbitrarily insert the scrap bourgeois law into communism, but indicated what was economically and politically inevitable in a society emerging out of the womb of capitalism. I mean, I think that's fair, but you can see how these can be abused. Oh, and we got more equations coming up. Democracy means equality. Actually, it means rule of the many. The great significance of the proletariat struggle for equality and equality as a slogan will be clear if we correctly interpret it. It means the evolution of classes. I agree. We've never achieved the evolution of classes, not even close. But democracy means only formal equality. Agreed again. Power. This is what we talk about. Formal equality is what I call power egalitarianism, for those of you who don't know. We have formal right to make decisions. So I agree with Lenin here. And as soon as equality is achieved for all the members of society in relation to the ownership of the means of production, that is, the equality of labor and wages, humanity will inevitably be confronted with the question of advancing further from formal equality to actual equality, aka the operation of will from each according to his ability to each according to his need. By what stages, by what means of the practical measure of humanity will proceed to this supreme aim, we do not and cannot know. I both agree, this is what I'm talking, I both agree with this, that we do not and cannot know, and I also find this to be maddening, because this is also easily abused. But it is important to realize how Infinitely mendacious it is to the ordinary bourgeois conception of socialism as something lifeless, rigid, and fixed once and for all, whereas in reality, only socialism will be the beginning of a rapid, genuine, truly mass forward movement, embracing the first majority and then the whole of the population in all spheres of the public and private life. Bam. I don't think you can really argue with that. I also think it's weird how much Bourdieuists reject democracy, and yet they also read the text. All right. Democracy is of enormous importance to the working class in its struggle against the capitalists for its emancipation, but democracy is by no means the boundary to be overstepped. It is only one of the stages on the road from the feudalism to capitalism, from capitalism to communism. There's a wiggishness here that I've never been comfortable with, because there are other roads that we could take. Democracy is a form of a state. It represents, on one hand, an organized systemic use of force against persons. But, on the other hand, it signifies a formal recognition of the equality of citizens, the equal right of all to determine the structure of and to administer the state. Power egalitarianism, guys. This is, in turn, the result of the fact that a certain stage in the development of democracy, it first wills together the class that wages a revolutionary struggle against the capitalists, the proletariat, and enables it to smash the atoms, wipe off the face of the earth, the bourgeoisie, even the Republican bourgeois, the state machine, the standing army, the police, and the bureaucracy, and to substitute with them a more democratic state machine, but a state machine nonetheless, in the shape of an armed workers who proceed to form a militia involving the entire population. Do you understand the implication of that? That's not a higher stage of communism promise. This is something Lenin failed to achieve. Also, for the socialist Republican people, the Republican bourgeois is an interesting thing to say you must smash. Anyway, here, quantity. Maybe this is why I've noticed that a lot of the Leninist, off-term Neo-Kautsky socialist republic people, they don't really love state and revolution that much as a text. And they've also been key on downplaying the importance of critique of the Gotha Program and their promotion of Lars Lee. And I think, and you know, Lars Lee always favors what is to be Bavarian over state and revolution. I think I see a trend here. But then again, that's why I started this whole series in the first place. Here, quantity turns into quality. As such a degree of democracy implies the overstepping of the boundaries of bourgeois society and the beginning of socialist reorganization. If really all take the part of administration of the state, capitalism cannot retain its hold. The development of capitalism, in turn, creates the preconditions that really enable all to take part in the administration of the state. Believe it or not, the stock market's part of that. Some of these preconditions are universal literacy. This is why, guys, I'm really worried about socialists talking about how literacy isn't necessary, which has already been achieved in a number of the most advanced capitalist countries. Then the training and disciplining of millions of workers by huge, complex, socialized apparatuses of the postal service, railways, big factories, large-scale commerce, banking, etc. I think it's interesting because so much of these socialized apparatuses have been atomized now. This is where I'm talking again. This is why I'm actually kind of a believer in decadence theory. All right. Given the economic preconditions, it is quite possible after the overthrow of capitalists and the bureaucrats to proceed immediately overnight to replace them in the control of the population and distribution and the works of keeping account of labor and products by armed workers and by the whole armed population. The question of control and accounting should not be confused with the question of scientifically trained staff of engineers, agronomists, and so on. These gentlemen are working today in obedience to the wishes of the capitalists and will work even better tomorrow in the obedience of the wishes of the armed workers. Yeah, you're not going to get rid of the intellectua. They're just going to serve the people. That's what Lenin's saying. Accounting and control. This is mainly what is needed for smooth working, for proper functioning, for the first phase of communist society. All citizens are transformed into higher employees of the state. And it's not really what they are. Yeah, that's also an extrapolation that Marx doesn't say. All citizens are workforce society, and if there is a worker state which administers that society, they are not the hired employees of the state. They are people working for society. Anyway, this is where there's a lot of this last section where he moves out of the, into what he thinks immediately needs to be done. This is where there's a lot of things that he's extrapolating that, while are not contra to Marx's text, seem to not be in it. He's making extra deductions and saying that's what Marx, extra inductions and saying that's what Marx means. All right. All citizens become employees and workers of a single countrywide state syndicate. That never had. Yeah. By the way, that isn't, the state syndicate is not the state owning partial joint stocks or controlling stocks in private corporations, guys. If you try to use state and revolution or critique of the program to justify that, you are not reading what the text says and only selecting stuff that is comforting for you, which is super common for people to do. Others require that they should work equally, do their proper share of work, and get equal pay. The accounting controls necessary for this have been simplified by capitalism to the utmost and reduced to the extraordinary simple operations, which an illiterate person can perform, of supervising and recording, knowledge of 4 rules of arithmetic, and issuing appropriate receipts. Yeah, basically, you just know how to do accounting, peeps. When the majority of people begin independently and everywhere to keep such accounts and to exercise control over the capitalists, now converted into employees too, and over intellectual gentry who preserve their capitalist habits, this control will become universal, general, and popular, and there'll be no getting away from it, and there will be nowhere to go. The whole of society will become a single office and a single factory with equality of labor and pay. But this factory discipline, which the proletariat, after defeating capitalists, after overthrowing the explorers, will extend to the whole society, is by no means our ideal or our ultimate goal. Bam! It is only a necessary step for the thorough cleansing of society of all the infamies and abominations of capitalist exploitation, and for further progress. Bam, bam! This is the part of Lenin I like. From the moment of all members of society, or at least the vast majority, have learned to administer the state themselves, have taken this work into their own hands. This is why cartelling bureaucrats and oligarchs are a problem, guys. Even Lenin knows it. Quote, back to the text. Have organized control over the insignificant capitalist majority, have over the gentry who wish to preserve their capitalist habits, and over the workers who have been thoroughly corrupted by capitalism. This is something that Lenin takes a little bit more seriously than Marx. From this moment, the need for the government of any kind begins to disappear altogether. The more complete the democracy, the nearer the moment it becomes unnecessary. It is interesting, actually, that Marxists would agree with classical liberals that the government which governs best governs least because it is withering away. Anyway, the more democratic the state, which consists of armed workers, and which no longer is a state in the proper sense of the word, the more rapidly every form of the state begins to wither away. I think I agree with this. It's not that we don't have governments, all right? It's that we don't have a state. You don't have anything permanent that is built on the labor of other people to tell other people what to do as a form of class rule. From all have learned to administer and actually independently administer social production, independently keep accounts, and exercise control over parasites, the sons of the wealthy, the swindlers, and over the gardens of the capitalist tradition, to escape from the popular accounting control whenever we become so incredibly difficult, with such rare exceptions, they will probably be accompanied by such swift and severe punishment, for the armed workers are practical men and not sentimental intellectuals, and they scarcely allow anyone to trifle with them, that the necessary of observing the simple fundamental rules of the community will become habit, and then the door will be thrown open for the transition to the first phase of communist society to its higher phase, and with its complete withering away of the state. So while there's some wiggle room that I think does create problems in this text, I think it's not a terrible reading of the critique of the Gotha Program schema. We're going to deal with people who argue that Lenin overstepped boundaries, and maybe more than even I think he did. I think there's a few equivocations in there that create the potentiality for abuse that does become abused. It's not because I have a very ambivalent view of the Soviet Union, and I think when people think we should celebrate it being gone, I find this crazy. The world without the Soviet Union has been a lot worse. But I also think there's a lot of nostalgia for the Soviet Union, the way there's nostalgia for Athenian democracy. It ignores where it failed up on its own goals, not just our goals imposed upon it. And it also, there's a lot of things with the PRC where we ignore what classical texts say to try to make them copacetic what the PRC does now. One can argue that the PRC has to go through a state of state capitalism to develop the forces to go through that. But then you're not even in the lower phases of socialism, and you should admit that. If you're going to come up with a schema that requires that, then do so, or admit that you think the schema needs to be changed, but don't try to change what the historical text said. Anyway, we'll be going to Karl Korsch's introduction. In our next series, there'll be a few other nailing it down episodes and other topics between the two. I hope you have enjoyed this. And once we get through these classic versions, including I gotta find some malice stuff on this and some later stuff, so that I make clear how this text is abused later on. I'm also probably going to do a section on the DeLeon theses and Bordiga's use of Lenin's use of Marx. We're going to go into modern historiography on the topic and the debates that come up around this and the new left, etc., where I might be more critical of contemporary theories. Right. You may find a ton of information, including stuff that's coming up in the future, in the show notes. And I hope you are enjoying this series. This one's probably going to take a little while, folks, even with me doing nailing it down every week. This requires, I'm slowly going through these texts that are in the public domain because I think people need to encounter them word for word, section for section, and think about them and process them like I do. And then process them on your own. I'm going to do synopsis of secondary research for a lot of the time, but are like other historical information that makes things clear. But I'm not going to read that word for word. But I do think when these classical arguments emerge, they need to be taken very slowly and very carefully when people are making claims about them. And I hear a lot of intro to 101 communism classes that make big claims about these texts that ignore what the texts say and only quote them selectively.